Hello everyone. My name is Vivek. I am a software developer. I make videos about containers, Kubernetes, Go as a programming language, distributed systems, and sometimes about software engineering in general. So if you have been liking the kinds of videos that I make, you should consider subscribing to the channel and you should follow me on Twitter as well. In this particular video, we are going to talk about conversion webhooks. What are conversion webhooks? Why do we exactly need them? And there are a lot of other surrounding things that we are going to talk about. In this video, we are not going to implement conversion webhook, but we are just going to set up a very basic understanding of conversion webhook, and in the subsequent videos we may try to actually implement conversion webhook from scratch. So if we talk about the CRD that we introduced when we were writing an operator named Kluster, so this is the CRD that we came up with. So let's just go ahead and try to look into this CRD very quickly. So this CRD, if we go to spec or specification, this custom resource definition introduces a resource in these versions. So if we go inside versions, we can see that we just have one version here named v1alpha1. It simply means that this custom resource definition that we are creating is going to introduce a resource named Kluster, and that resource would be available inside version v1alpha1. So this is what this CRD was doing. Now let's take an example of for example, let's say now you have been serving your cluster resource using v1alpha1 version, but now you think that there is a need to change in the schema of cluster resource. So obviously we also specify schema using Open API v3 validation. So let's assume that the schema that we have specified or the resource type that we have needs some changes, or it is a bit stable now. So let's say we want that our cluster resource should also be served using v1beta1 version. So there are a lot of benefits of this that we are going to look into in a bit, but let's assume this is the use case that you want to serve your resource using v1alpha1 version as well as v1beta1 version. And the reasons might be, as we discussed, there are chances that you want to change the schema of how cluster resource looks like, and there are also chances that you want to let's say notify users, or you want to assure users that now this particular resource is mature enough to move into v1beta1. So these are some of the reasons why you would want to serve a particular resource from two versions. Now if you want to serve this particular cluster resource using v1beta1 as well, you should not just drop support for v1alpha1 because the users who are using v1alpha1 of the resource would start getting errors, and that would be a problem. So what you would want to rather do is you would serve the resource using both the versions, v1alpha1 and v1beta1, and you will ask your users to migrate to v1beta1 resources, and then once you know that your users have been migrated to v1beta1, they are no longer using v1alpha1 version of cluster resource. In that case, you can just remove v1alpha1 version of the cluster resource. So this is why you would want to support two versions of a resource. And if you try to do a lot of complex things, adding new fields, adding new features to your API, in that case it's always, I would say, useful or recommended to keep supporting earlier or previous version, and then add support for newer version, and then iteratively remove support for the stale version. So this is why we would want to serve our cluster resource or any resource using two versions. Now let's talk about how do we, for example, if we want to create if we want to serve a resource using two versions, how the CRD is going to look like. So now if we go to this particular manifest that we have, CRD v1.yaml. So if you see here, we are introducing again a cluster resource, and for versions we have specified, if you see here, we have specified two versions. One is v1alpha1 and another one is v1beta1. So it simply means that cluster resources would be served from v1alpha1 as well as v1beta1 API version, or in other words, we can say that this particular resource or cluster resources are available in v1alpha1 as well as v1beta1 resource API versions. Now that we know the resource is available in two versions, we will have to make sure, or we will have to specify which particular versions should be persisted into the database that we are using in Kubernetes or etcd, and that is the reason we are specifying storage here. So it simply means that both of these versions are supported. So if user tries to get a cluster resource from v1alpha1, he would get the resource. He would, if he tries to get the cluster resource from v1beta1, he wouldn't face any problem. He would successfully get the resource from v1beta1 as well. But if we talk about how that resource is going to get persisted into etcd, v1alpha1 version is going to get persisted into etcd, and that is what we are specifying using this storage true field. So I hope this makes sense. And whenever we try to create a particular resource, so we are going to look into that in a bit. So if we try to create a cluster resource using v1alpha1 API version, it is going to get persisted into the etcd successfully. But if we try to create a cluster resource using v1beta1 API version, in that case it would automatically be converted to v1alpha1 API version, and then it would be persisted to etcd. And the reason is, we have specified that in etcd this is the version that should be stored. So now that we know what are the significance of these two fields, let's go ahead and try to create this CRD. So I already have a Kubernetes cluster set up, and I am going to create the CRD v1, and if I try to get the CRD, we see that the CRD has been successfully created. And we know that this CRD introduced a resource. That resource is available via two versions. So now let's go ahead and try to create the cluster resource using v1alpha1 version. So if you see here, we are specifying that this particular cluster resource should be created in this particular group and this particular version. We can create a resource using v1beta1 version as well, because again, as we saw, this CRD says that cluster resource is available through two versions. So let's go ahead and try to create this custom resource. So create -f v1alpha1.yaml, and we should see that a resource has been created. So alpha cluster has been created. But before discussing about other things, let me very quickly go ahead and try to talk about the schema of these versions. So in here, if you see in v1alpha1, let's say we want to create a Kubernetes cluster, and we are specifying all the nodes using array of node type. So if you see here, we are specifying all the nodes by the I would say size of the nodes. So two nodes are going to be of this size and one node is going to be of this size. So this is what this particular open API schema says. But as we discussed, let's say after some time we decided that this is not how our schema should look like. We decided that instead of duplicating these things, what we can do is we can just get the size and then count of the machines, so something like that. So size and then quantity, and that is what we have specified in v1 beta 1 version. So if you see here, we are specifying array of objects, and this object is going to be size and quantity. So I hope that makes sense. So now that we have created alpha cluster, let's go ahead and try to get the clusters and see how the output looks like. So kubectl get clusters, and we want to get the cluster name alpha cluster and -o YAML, and we should see this particular cluster. If you see at this particular response, even though we have not specified any version here, so we are not saying that we want to get alpha cluster from v1alpha1 version or v1beta1 version. We are by default getting it from v1beta1 version, and the reason is by default Kubernetes follows this canonical versioning. So for example, it depends on how stable a particular API version is, and that the most stable API version is preferred over the other API versions. So the most common ones are v1alpha1, v1beta1 and v1. So since we don't have v1, we just have v1alpha1 and v1beta1, and maturity wise v1beta1 is preferred. That is the reason we are by default getting the response from v1beta1, even though we created the resource using v1alpha1 API version. So that is about which particular API version gets prioritized by default. Now let's look into this particular response. So by default we are getting the resource from v1beta1, and this is how it looks like. But if we explicitly specify that we want to get the resource from v1alpha1, so this is the syntax that can be used to specify I want this particular resource from this API version. So if you see here, even though we have specified that we want the resource from v1alpha1, and if we specify, we have already seen this, but just to be more clear, we have specified v1alpha1 here and we have specified v1beta1 here, and we don't see any difference in the response. But this is not we expected, did we? Because we have specified the schema in v1alpha1 to be array of strings, but in case of v1beta1, this schema is array of objects, and that object contains size slug and quantity. So if things are working as expected, or ideally in case of v1beta1, we should get response something like this, and not like this. So this is where conversion webhooks come into picture. So if we are supporting a resource to be served from more than 2 versions, so to convert, I would say, to make that conversion happen, so that if we, as I said, if we try to get the resource from v1beta1, the schema would be successfully converted to the v1beta1 schema, and then it would be returned. To facilitate all these things, conversion webhook can be used or can be deployed on your Kubernetes cluster. So I hope this makes sense on why do we need conversion webhooks. Let me very quickly try to summarize that. So we introduced a resource called cluster, and we also have specified that this cluster resource should be available in two versions, v1alpha1 and v1beta1. Now, when we created a cluster resource in v1alpha1 version, when we try to get that from v1alpha1 as well as v1beta1, we don't see any difference in the response, but ideally we should see the difference because the schema for v1beta1 is entirely different. So this is where the concept of conversion webhooks come into picture. Now, if we talk about how exactly, so for example, let's say if we created a conversion webhook, how exactly this conversion happens. So let's say we obviously have our API server. Let's say this is the API server, and client asks for, let's say, a particular resource, and in our case this resource is cluster. So by default, based on canonical versioning, our API server is going to look for v1, and I'm just talking about some versions, but there are a lot of other versions. So by default, it is going to look for v1, v1beta1, and v1alpha1. So in our case, we don't have v1 present. We just have v1beta1 and v1alpha1, but we have specified that the storage version is v1alpha1. So this resource was stored as v1alpha1. So it would get back to the API server, and then API server would make a request to our, I would say, webhook server, and then this webhook server is going to convert that v1alpha1 resource to v1beta1, and then it would respond back to API server, and then API server in turn respond back to the client. So here we have v1alpha1, and API server makes a request to conversion webhook to convert this v1alpha1 into v1beta1 so that we can respond back v1beta1 to the client. So this is how I would say the architecture of webhook controller looks like. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is this webhook server that we just talked about. We are going to implement this in one of the coming videos. This can be run as a service in your Kubernetes cluster, and we can specify details of that service in your CRD itself. So in your CRD, to specify conversion webhook, what you can do is in CRD spec you can specify conversion, and then you can specify all the details. For example, how do you want this conversion to happen? So in our case, we want this conversion to happen using webhook, so we can use a strategy to be webhook, and then we will have to specify webhook details, for example, the service and the endpoint. So this is how we can specify which particular webhook conversion or converter can be used to convert between these two versions. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is, for example, let's say you have been supporting v1alpha1 and v1beta1 for quite some time, and now you want v1alpha1. You want to, whenever a user creates a resource using v1alpha1 version, you want to inform them that this particular version has been deprecated, and that can be done using by setting this field deprecated equals to true. So it simply means that this particular version or resource from this version has been deprecated, and you can also set the deprecation warning let me see if the spelling is correct, and you can specify custom message here. So for example, cluster resources from v1alpha1 versions are deprecated. And now if we go ahead and try to, for example, let's say, let me apply the CRD once again, or let's delete the CR that we have already created, and then we are going to apply. And then we are going to apply the CRD. So CRD has been configured. Now if I go ahead and try to create this resource using v1alpha1 version, we should get this particular deprecation message. So if kubectl create -f and v1alpha1, here we go. And I'm pretty sure that you have seen this message when you try to create Kubernetes native resources when they are deprecated. So this is how that is done. This is how we can do that for our custom resources. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is, let's say in the very same example, if we try to create the resource from v1beta1, so if we go ahead and try to create this particular resource, we are going to have a problem, because we have specified that the resources are going to be stored as v1alpha1. This is the storage version, and in case of v1beta1, the schema is entirely different. So while changing this schema to v1alpha1 schema, we are going to have some problems. We would not be able to, or Kubernetes automatically would not be able to convert that, so we would not get the correct details. So this is a problem that I just wanted to highlight here. I think this is pretty much it that I wanted to talk about conversion webhooks. I hope this was helpful to you. If you think this is going to be useful to your colleagues, your classmates, share it with them. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you.